Hello, everyone. My name's Rach. I'm a very grateful recovered alcoholic and addict, and really great to be back with you. I just want to say a massive thank you to Tom and Samantha for your service, and my wonderful sponsor, Toya, for covering me over the last 2 weeks. And welcome to anyone who's new on this book study. So we are on page 9. That's where Toya left off last week. But I'm just going to do a little recap over what we've covered so far. Because my big book sponsor, she used to just do a little brief overview of it, and I found it really helpful to kind of summarize what we just read. So just going back to the preface, it starts off with this amazing um, statistics at the beginning of the book. If we've got any doubt about the program, it kind of kicks us off with some stats about just how many books are sold. And it also tells us, in that forward to the first edition, um, that this book is going to show us. So straight away, before we even get into the meat and bones, this book is going to show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered. That is the main purpose of this book. And when we turn the page on the forward to the first edition, it tells us the only requirement for membership is an honest desire to stop drinking. And the forward to the second edition is just a meaty little forward about the history of AA, how it came about. They talk about the traditions in there, but they're also just starting to drop this key theme that goes on throughout the book that tells us that we must. Oh, I'm going to show you my little thing that I made. We must, boom, boom, boom. With Batman power in this workshop, we must carry our message to another alcoholic if we want to save ourselves. It says strenuous work, one alcoholic with another, was vital to permanent recovery. So, and it, as I said, it talks about the traditions and telling us we have to hang together or we'll die separately. And then we've got the forward to the third edition and the forward to the fourth edition, which kind of just tells us that, it doesn't matter where the AA program is dropped, what language it's in, whereabouts it is. When this AA seed is planted, it starts to take roots. And literature has played such a vital role, because remember that the 12 Alcoholics Anonymous as we know it today, the global fellowship that's all over Zoom every day, every night, has come from this book, the literature. And that's how we can preserve the integrity of the program, by sticking to the clear-cut directions as outlined in this book. So the doctor's opinion, whenever I'm working with a sponsee, I always say, like, do you know who they're talking about? Do you know who the doctor is? And try to paint a picture of Dr. Silkworth. This is a guy, he wasn't an alcoholic. He dedicated his whole career to us, to alcoholics and drug addicts. He was, he was minted. He was the most not minted, but he worked at the most prominent hospital in New York. So he specialized in it. He was uh, a medical director. He was the top dog in this specializing hospital in New York. So he had all the resources at his disposal, and he worked out that we are bodily and mentally different than our fellows. He gave us these key pieces of information that the real alcoholic is hopeless without a divine intervention, without spirit, without this moral psychology. And he had the humility to kind of say, I can't help these people. They're absolutely hopeless. So the grave nature of the illness is crucial. It's fundamental that we let newcomers know that. And then obviously we've got this allergy of the body. He identified with his medical estimate that we cannot, we create this phenomenon of craving. And once we start, we just can't stop. You can't he can't explain it, but he knows it to be true. And this obsession of the mind, it doesn't matter how much we want to leave it alone, we just absolutely cannot. So Dr. Silkworth is crucial in giving us this information at the beginning of the book, and his opinion is the fact that this program works. He's seen it with his own eyes, and now we can honestly say that we have seen it with our own eyes, our own experience, and what we can gauge from the whole world, the whole fellowship around the world. So then we go into chapter 1, Bill's story. And again, whenever I'm working with a sponsee, I ask, do you know who Bill Wilson is? Do you know what he looks like? I always encourage people to go and look him up, get a picture so you can. I remember being in the rooms for ages and I didn't even know what Bill Wilson looked like. I think there must have been pictures of him around. And then, so there's something about the understanding who these people are. It helps put a name to a face. And Bill Wilson is 12-stepping us in this chapter. So he heads off this after we've got this medical estimate from Dr. Silkworth. And he's talking about the progression of the illness up until where we left off. So what we're looking for is that identification. On page 58, it says, we're going to tell you what we were like, what happened, and what we are like now. That tallies up with experience, strength, and hope. That's what we do when we do a main share. And I remember when it was pointed out to me that it doesn't say what it was like, what happened and what it is like now, because my circumstances might be very, very different from somebody else's, but my thinking, my behavior is going to be identifiable with another addict or alcoholic. So he starts off telling us about his life. He felt a bit lonely. He felt like he was becoming a part of life. Drink was taking a more important role in his life. He was striving, you could say restless, irritable, and discontented. The disease of more, he wanted more. He was chasing money, trying loads of different things. And he ended up being pulled into this maelstrom, this whirlpool of finances and business and money and leadership. And obviously, I guess when my motive is not selfless, when my motive is selfish, then I'm on the wrong track. For an alcoholic or an addict, this is always going to end up because that is the root of our problem, right? The selfishness and self-centeredness. He actually did become an amazing world leader, but he did it out of the selflessness of bringing this fellowship to the world. So we're seeing in Bill's story the progression of his illness, and it ends up just before we get to page 9 where we left off. He's saying he's trembling. He stepped from the hospital a broken man. Fear sobered him for a bit. I'm just reading from page 8, halfway down. Then came the insidious insanity of the first drink, and on Armistice Day 1934 I was off again. Everybody became resigned to the certainty that I would have to be shut up somewhere or I would stumble along to a miserable end. So he's really painted a picture of how things have just gone worse and worse. He's dragged a mattress downstairs. Lois is gone to work in a department store. He's trying to hang on at the brokerage places. People don't want to know who he is. He's having fights with taxi cab drivers, losing jobs. He had to move in with the parent-in-laws, the parents-in-law, you know what I mean? So he's really painting a picture of how bad it gets. And then he says how dark it is before the dawn. So he's giving us some hope. In reality, that was the beginning of my last debauch, which means corrupt, moral purity, I was soon to be catapulted into what I like to call the fourth dimension of existence. So where, we said rocketed into the fourth dimension of existence, I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. So we've got some hope here. This is his experience from the depths of his despair. He was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. My great grand sponsor loves this saying, which I also love as well. The best is yet to come. I love it. It's not actually in the big book, but it always sticks with me. So near the end of that bleak November, I sat drinking in my kitchen. I'm just on the last paragraph of page 8. With a certain satisfaction, I reflected there was enough gin concealed about the house to carry me through that night and the next day. My wife was at work. I wondered whether I dared hide a full bottle of gin near the head of our bed. I would need it before daylight. So things, he can't even go through the night now. He's thinking, I'm going to wake up. I need to have this drink throughout the night. My musing was interrupted by the telephone. The cheery voice of an old friend asked if he might come over. So this is the massive turning point here. The first 8 pages is all about the progression of the drinking. Now, this is where Toya left off. And remember that the italic, it cost them a lot of money to print in italic because they didn't have all the printing machinery, and it wasn't so easy to do. So they really wanted us to pay attention. He was sober. This was unbelievable. It was years since I could remember him coming to New York in that condition. I was amazed. Rumor had it that he had been committed for alcoholic insanity. I wondered how he had escaped. So this is literally what used to happen to drunks back in the day. Can you imagine waking up out of a blackout in an institution where you can't get out? They literally think you're bonkers. That's what used to happen. So Bill Wilson is like, oh, he must have literally escaped from this mental asylum. Of course he would have dinner, and then I could drink openly with him. And it says, unmindful of his welfare. I put a little question mark in there. The selfishness of the alcoholic. Can you relate to that? Because Bill Wilson's thinking, I thought only of recapturing the spirit of other days, question mark. There was that time that we had chartered an airplane to complete a JAG. So what that means there is Bill Wilson and Ebby was very, very wealthy. And he had a summer house down in Vermont. And there was an airfield that was opened, a newly opened airfield. And they thought it would be fun. They were on a session and they thought, let's charter a plane and be the first people to land a plane on this new airfield. So they went and they had their drink ready. They convinced a pilot to take them around and land them on this thing. And when they showed up, there was actually a big procession going on. They were doing a little run through, and they had the mayor was there and this whole big procession, and Bill Wilson could hardly walk, and Ebby was crashed out in the plane. And so for them it was one of those, oh, do you remember when we did this? But can you relate to that? Do you remember regurgitating stories that's we've talked about this a million times. We haven't actually done anything fun in a long time, but here I am still talking about the good old days. And then he says, his coming was an oasis in this dreary desert of futility. He's quite poetic with his language. An oasis is like a big water hole and in this dreary desert of futility. So, like a desert of futility means pointlessness, uselessness. So he's painting this picture of like I'm imagining like a barren um, Groundhog Day. You know that feeling of alcoholism, addiction, a desert of futility, dry, dull, boring, arduous, pointlessness. And then his friend coming is like this oasis, like he's just found this pool of water that he can jump into. He's coming, the very thing, an oasis. Drinkers are like that. So the door opened and he stood there, fresh skinned and glowing. Now, think about our skin when we come into recovery. I don't know about you guys, but I looked grey, like dead. You know what I mean? Like ill, malnourished, but puffy, just ill, like yellowy grey. Um, it says there was something about his eyes, and I love that because do you remember losing the twinkle in your eyes? I mean, by the end of it, I couldn't even look in the mirror, but that dullness, that loss of life and energy and sparkle that happens, with this kind of illness. It's when you see even people on the streets and stuff, it's almost like I can see the fact that they've been possessed. You know what I mean? It's like we're possessed, we're like zombies, we're kind of dead, we're just chasing this mind altering substance to get us out of this world, you know? So there was something about his eyes. He was inexplicably different. What had happened? And I've squiggly underlined that inexplicably different. Something happens to us when we have a psychic change. This magic, something is lifted. It's it talks in the book about this revolutionary change. It is absolute magic. What had happened? I pushed a drink across the table. He refused it. Disappointed, but curious. I wondered what had got into the fellow. He wasn't himself. Come, what's all this about? I queried. He looked straight at me. I love this bit. Simply, but smilingly, he said, I've got religion. And I'm just thinking about, I'm thinking about on page 18 where it says, it's talking about the sponsor and somebody armed with the facts. And there's loads of references in this book, in working with others, but all throughout the book, it's going to go on to say he did no ranting. The fact that when I know that this actually works, I've got this kind of confidence. I've got this like passion, this authenticity that this thing works. And I'm thinking about Ebby going like simply but smilingly, I've got religion. He's been relieved of his drink problem. Ebby did actually drink again, unfortunately. So Bill said I was aghast, meaning shocked and horrified, because again, Bill had this plan of, well, we're going to get smashed together. We're going to talk about when we chartered that plane and all of the good old days when we used to have loads of fun together and get hammered. I was aghast. So that was it. Last summer, an alcoholic crackpot. Now I suspected a little cracked about religion, cracked in the head, like not right. Um, he had that starry eyed look. There it is, that twinkle in our eyes, which comes back when we're not, drinking and using ourselves to death. So he had that starry eyed look. Yes, the old boy was on fire, all right, but bless his heart, let him rant. Besides, my gin would last longer than his preaching. So selfishly, he's, first of all, he's like, oh, I'm shocked, I'm horrified. What do you mean you don't want to drink? But then shortly after, he's like, "Oh, yay, more gin for me," which is what I would probably be thinking as well. So here, this is really important. I've squiggly underlined it. But he did no ranting. Beautiful. In a matter of fact way, he told how two men had appeared in court, persuading the judge to suspend his commitment. So these are two men from the Oxford group. And the Oxford group was, um, this quite elite group of Christian people who started Frank Bookman, and he wanted to change the world. Basically, he wanted to help everyone, and they had the drunk squad where people, and Dr. Bob was a part of the Oxford group with his wife. But these two men, and apparently it was three, I think Roland Hazard was in this little crew as well. They'd gone to court, and it was their uncle who was the judge. So they had persuaded the judge to suspend his commitment and said, please don't lock him up. We'll take him and we'll get him well. And there were six, tenets. I just pulled it earlier from. So the six tenets of the Oxford group were complete deflation. So this is like our step one, isn't it? Admitted powerlessness, dependence on God. That's like our 2 and 3, and all of the steps really, I guess, 6 and 7, 11, 10. Moral inventory. So that's like our step 4 and our step 10. Confession. That's like step 5. Restitution. That's our step 8 and 9. And continued work with others in need. That's like our step 12. So they had told of a simple religious idea. I love it when it says simple. And a practical program of action. So I've highlighted and squiggly underlined that practical program of action. Now that was the 6 tenets of the Oxford group, which later became part of our 12 steps. And I can put that in the group afterwards if you want. So that was 2 months ago, and the result was self-evident. It worked. Now that's a really, really important part there. 2 months. So Ebby Thatcher is just 2 months sober, and already he's thinking, who can I help? Who can I help? Bill Wilson was 6 months sober when he went to help Dr. Bob, but he had already been trying to help loads of alcoholics before, but he was helping out alcoholics who weren't willing, who didn't want to get well. And what Bill Wilson learned along the way is whilst he was trying to help other alcoholics, he was staying sober himself. So I always find it really scary and dangerous when I hear people in the rooms saying, just get a bit of sobriety under your belt. Just wait a year before you start to sponsor. I can't help but say, welcome, Karen. I can't help but, say to people, this is not what it says in the book. Bill Wilson was in his hospital bed when he was like, it suddenly came to me that there are other alcoholics that I can help. So, and it worked. These are facts, right? This is proof. It worked. He can see it in his friends. The result was self-evident. It worked. He had come to pass his experience along to me. Very important 2-letter word, one of the most important words in the big book. If I cared to have it, ? Whenever I take anybody through this book, I'm always asking them, do you want it? Do you care to have it? Are you willing to go to any lengths? I was shocked, but interested. We're just on the top of page 10. Certainly, I was interested. I had to be, for I was hopeless. That beautiful moment, that window of opportunity. that hopelessness, that reoccurring thread. The paradox of the program is that I have to be completely hopeless before I'm willing to listen. And this is what Bill's going to start telling us about now. So I've put a question mark after that as well. For I was hopeless, you know, and I asked sponsees, are you hopeless without this power in your life? He talked for hours. Childhood memories rose before me. I could almost hear the sound of the preacher's voice as I sat still Sundays way over there on the hillside. There was that proffered temperance pledge I never signed. So I'll read the paragraph and then I'll just break it down a little bit. My grandfather's good-natured contempt of some church folk and their doings, his insistence that the spheres really had their music, but his denial of the preacher's right to tell him how he must listen, his fearlessness as he spoke of these things just before he died. These recollections welled up from the past. They made me swallow hard. So Ebby's come to see Bill, and he was thinking, great, I'm going to get to hang out with my friend, my drinking buddy who drinks like me, if not worse. And Ebby shows up and he looks different. His eyes are sparkling, his skin's different. He was inexplicably different. I push a drink across the table. He doesn't want it. I thought he's been locked up. And he's saying that something's happened to him. He's had this change. And all of a sudden, Bill Wilson is starting to think about his understanding of religion. And he's thinking back to his grandfather, who actually fell out with the church. And what he's saying here is these memories rose up. And he's not in the church. He's sitting on the hillside looking at the church with his granddad on Sundays. So normally people would be in the church on a Sunday, but they're way over there on the hillside. He said, there's that proffered temperance pledge I never signed. So that temperance means to moderate. So in church, he was offered something to sign to say, I'm going to be a good Christian. I'm going to be a good member of society. I'm not going to overdrink, adultery, whatever the things are on this pledge. I don't actually know. But it's a temperance pledge that he never signed. He said, my grandfather's good-natured contempt of some church folk. So contempt means worthless or beneath consideration. So granddad is like, yeah, you're beneath my consideration. The church folk, I'm not willing to listen, because he's saying, and their doings, his insistence that the spheres really had their music, but his denial of the preacher's right to tell him how they must listen. Now, a sphere is a round ball, isn't it? It's like a sphere is a shape, a round shape, but it also means energy. It means I looked it up earlier. I should have kept the definition of it. It means an entity of energy. So he's saying that this ball of energy, of life, of the world, of God, has their music, but I'm not going to be told how to believe. And then the granddad's fearlessness as he spoke of these things just before he died. And Bill Wilson obviously has a really close relationship with his granddad. These recollections welled up from the past. They made me swallow hard. So he's really thinking back to this idea of religion and what his attachment is to it. So this is where we're starting to see Bill Wilson opening up his mind. And then we've got We Agnostics, which talks to us about our prejudice against this idea called God. And it's beautiful because it helps us to really start expanding, like, why do we believe? Why do we think what we think, you know? So it says that wartime day in old Winchester Cathedral came back again. So there's 3 references in the big book to the Winchester Cathedral moment. And if you did want to jot them down, on page 1, he talks about it for the first time. And he talks about, this ominous warning, which he failed to heed. He said, I wandered outside. My attention was caught by a doggerel on an old tombstone. And because the tombstone had the name on it was Thomas Thatcher, and his mate was called Ebby Thatcher. So I don't know if there's some connection there to him thinking, oh, is that my friend? Is that a relative of my friend or whatever? But again, what Bill Wilson is starting to explain through this is that he's recollecting this old time in Winchester Cathedral was years ago, but he's being brought back to these ominous warnings, these, his kind of his God incidents, his opening his mind. I had always believed in a power greater than myself. Question mark. It's a good question. Have you believed in something greater? Have you believed in some energy or some power or some force? I had often pondered these things. I was not an atheist, so not trying to be patronizing, but I needed to define what an atheist was and what an agnostic was, because I hadn't heard that word agnostic until it was in this chapter. So an atheist, a religious person is somebody who definitely believes in God. And an atheist is the other end of this spectrum, and it's somebody who definitely does not believe in God. And an agnostic is somewhere in the middle. They don't believe and they don't disbelieve. They don't know, or they don't care, or they're not religious and they're not religious. So he's saying, I was not an atheist. Few people really are. For that means blind faith in the strange proposition that this universe originated in a cipher and aimlessly rushes nowhere. A cipher is it's like a secret code. It means zero, it means nothing. So he's saying, well, if there's no power, it means that this universe is just nothing and it's going nowhere. My intellectual heroes, the chemists, the astronomers, even the evolutionists, suggested vast laws and forces at work. So, Bill Wilson, he identifies himself as an academic. He identifies himself as, an intelligent person. He's got respect for his intellectual heroes, the chemists, the astronomers, the evolutionists, and they're suggesting vast laws and forces at work. Despite contrary indications, so opposite views and thoughts, I had little doubt that a mighty purpose and rhythm underlay all. I've squiggly underlined that mighty purpose. So already his mind is shifting a little bit and he's starting to think, well, there must be something going on. Otherwise, this just everything means nothing. These people that I respect are lying, and that's not the truth. They're really smart. So how could there be so much of precise and immutable law and no intelligence? So precise and immutable law, immutable means unchanging or unable to be changed. So again, he's referring to the scientists, the facts of all of these people that he respects, that they're proving that there's something bigger. He's saying that there has to be, and no intelligence. I simply had to believe in a spirit of the universe. And notice the capitals there on S and U, that whenever these definitions of God, because there's lots of different words in the big book that describe God, and and they're beautiful. I know people have done it before, but in We Agnostics it says to us to Think about these definitions and ask yourself what they mean to you. What does that mean to you? Spirit of the universe, and there's loads of different. So one day I'm actually going to go through the big book and I'm going to write out myself all of the different words that they use for God, and I'm going to sit and ponder each one as a little exercise, like what does that mean to me, you know um but it also tells us in We Agnostics that how could we comprehend um a supreme being anyhow, because really, if you think about it, my tiny little brain compared to everything, it's like I'm probably not going to get the answer, but it might help have a deeper connection to it and open our minds even more. So I simply had to believe in a spirit. I love that spirit of the universe, who knew neither time nor limitation. That makes me think of, is it Einstein? Oh my God, I'm going to get it wrong. Is it Einstein? The time, someone can write it in the chat and help, or yeah, say it out, somebody. The time, what's the famous, is it Einstein? There's no time, there's no space. Yeah. Oh, okay. We'll get to it at the end. Someone will help me remember. Whenever I doubt myself, I always you sort of doubt yourself and then you've lost it. But anyway, yeah, with ministers. Oh no, so I knew neither time limitation, but that was as far as I had ever gone. With ministers and the world's religions, I parted right there. When they talked of a God personal to me, who was love, superhuman strength, and direction, I became irritated and my mind snapped shut against such a theory. Question mark. Can you relate to that? Now, if you think about those words, they're saying love, superhuman strength, and direction. I became irritated and my mind snapped shut against such a theory. And it talks about, it's because I've read We Agnostics today. It talks about this belligerent, arrogance, this kind of laborious, perverse way of like saying no to religion, and how we just shut it down without any experience of it. In We Agnostics, it talks a lot about prejudice, to prejudge something. So Bill Wilson at this stage, I don't know if I've done this before in this book study, a little visual. Sponsy did it with me and I just thought it was brilliant. This is my understanding about life. So for anyone listening on the recording, I've got my little blinkers on the side of my eyes. This is how I see life. This is what I think about life. This is my experiences. This is everything I think I know about life, religion, whatever. Now let's just add on the drunken smash goggles. So my vision is warped with the drunken goggles. And what recovery has done is made me go like this and expand my blinkers so they go off and turn around and see the rest of the whole world. And if I can keep that open mind, like get rid of the drunken goggles and actually just look around and see from an entirely different view, that's what I'm going to get. But Bill Wilson is stuck in his ways at this stage. And we're top of page 11. He says, to Christ, I conceded the certainty of a great man, not too closely followed by those who claimed him, capital H. So he thinks, yep, Christ is a great man, and yep, those people who follow him and do as he says, they're great too. His moral teaching, most excellent. Okay, he's agreeing with all of that. For myself, I had adopted those parts which seemed convenient and not too difficult. The rest I disregarded, question mark. So Bill Wilson is talking about his religion, but if we apply this to our own recovery, let's think about our own experiences, but then that of the people that we've met in recovery. Do you know anyone who has cherry picked and said, yeah, okay, I've got the self knowledge of step one. I like praying, so I'm going to pray, but I'm not going to do my nightly review. I'm not going to do a spot check inventory because I'm too busy. I'm at work or whatever. You know, the things that are convenient and not too difficult, the rest I disregarded. Danger zone, danger zone. My great grand sponsor said this is a full course menu. It's not a buffet. You can't pick and choose. So the wars which had been fought, the burnings and the chicanery religious dispute had facilitated, made me sick. So chicanery, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that word right, but it means deception. It means carnage, trickery. So Bill Wilson is saying, you know, because he had gone to war, hadn't he? He wasn't on the front line, but he saw some of the devastation of what had happened in the war. And he's saying the wars which had been fought, the burnings and the chicanery, so the deception and carnage and trickery that religious dispute had facilitated, made me sick. Okay, Mr. Judgy Judgeson, which I can be as well. I honestly doubted whether, on balance, the religions of mankind had done any good. Judging from what I had seen in Europe and since, the power of God in human affairs was negligible. The brotherhood of man a grim jest. So again, do you remember in in the 60s? Is it on page 62? I just have to find it now. I'm pretty sure it's 62 where he's talking about the Florida sunshine lulling. 61, 62. One sec, it's not 62. Oh, it's 61. You know, the retired businessman who lolls in the Florida sunshine in winter, complaining about the sad state of the nation, the minister who sighs over the sins of the 20th century. So again, with my little tiny blinkered vision, I'm making a whole big judgment on something that I don't really have any experience with. So he's saying, if there was a devil, he seemed the boss universal, capitalized, boss universal. So that means all powerful, right? And he's talking about the devil. He certainly had me. So what he's talking about here is alcoholism. If there was a devil, alcoholism, he seemed the boss universal, and he certainly had me, because he's being possessed by this illness. He's powerless. But then he says, but my friend sat before me, and he made the point blank declaration that God had done for him what he could not do for himself. And again, it's reminding me of Ebby Thatcher sitting in front of him, this point blank declaration, this simple but smilingly, this confidence in saying, yeah, guess what? Something magical has happened to me. Really calm, but really self-assured. This is the truth. God had done for him what he could not do for himself. His human will had failed. I put a question mark there. Has your human will failed? In my book, I've got over and over. Doctors had pronounced him incurable. Well, remember, Bill Wilson has just gone through that. I don't think we read it, but you would have read it with Toya. Bill Wilson was just listening in as Dr. Silkworth on page 7 at the bottom of the page. It said, This was the finish, the curtain, it seemed to me. My weary and despairing wife was informed that it will all end with heart failure or delirium tremens. I would develop a wet brain, perhaps within a year. She would soon have to give me over to the undertaker or the asylum. So Bill Wilson is literally there. And Ebby Thatcher is saying doctors had pronounced him incurable. Society was about to lock him up. Ebby just got saved by the skin of his teeth by um, the Oxford group guys. Like myself, he had admitted complete defeat. Question mark. Step one, right? Fully conceded to our innermost self that we were alcoholic. And then we got some good news. Then he had, in effect, been raised from the dead, suddenly taken from the scrap heap to a level of life better than the best he had ever known. Now imagine that. Ebby Thatcher had a good life, right? He's loaded. He's got this big house in Vermont. They used to go around drinking. They used to have all this fun. Ebby Thatcher has come 2 months sober, inexplicably different, and he's telling Bill Wilson, mate, I have got a better life than I had ever known. I've been taken from the scrap heap, just about to die. It's magic. This stuff is magic. So, had this power originated in him? Obviously, it had not. There had been no more power in him than there was in me at that minute, and that was none at all. So, again, if we think about all the people all around the world, they're all saying the same thing. They were powerless. They're not magic, they're not special, they're not different. They're just following a set of clear cut directions that has meant that they have this defense, which means that they don't have to pick up. And just again, because I've read We Agnostics earlier, it says in every one of these cases, these people are strikingly agreed that they have gained access to. So, what the 12 steps does for us is it gives us the steps and the tools to gain access to a power greater than ourselves whenever we need it, whenever we want it. I can tap in. If I take the action, if I don't take the action, then I'm going to stay wrapped up in the bondage of self. Painful, painful. So he says that floored me. It began to look as though religious people were right after all. Here was something at work in a human heart which had done the impossible. Think of think of the all the parents in the room, or the people who have every reason not to pick up, but they can't. It's impossible. But what Ebby has shown Bill is that this thing absolutely works. My ideas about miracles were drastically revised right then. Never mind the musty past. Here sat a miracle. They've used miracles twice in the past two sentences, because that's what we are, right? Absolutely godly, divine, indescribable, miraculous, angels, magic, miracles. Here sat a miracle directly across the kitchen table. He shouted great tidings. I had to look it up. I always ask sponsees, I'm like, do you know what a tidings means? And everyone, myself included, always thinks of the song, Good Tidings We Bring. We wish you a Merry Christmas. It means news or information. So great news, great information. I saw that my friend was much more than inwardly reorganized. This is beautiful. He was on a different footing. His roots grasped new soil. So there's lots of references. I love the growth analogies and You know, Bill Wilson uses quite a lot of, I've been meaning to one day, I just need to find the time. All of the he uses a lot of building analogies and he uses quite a lot of growth analogies. And this kind of reminds me of in the 60s, where it talks about the root of my problem is selfishness and self-centeredness. And if the roots of my problem is based in self-centeredness, and you think about what comes out of any root, it's like it's going to flower. But if the root is selfishness and self-centeredness, what's going to come out of that is not going to be good. And here it's like he was on a different footing. His roots grasped new soil. So I sort of think of me in my recovery. I'm grasping this nutritious, this fulfilling, this spiritual, this kind, tolerant, patient, loving, trying to be new soil. Whereas when I'm in the madness, I'm like, I'm sort of poisoned with resentment and fear and self pity and all my character defects. And everything that comes out of that is going to be tainted basically by self centeredness. So, yeah, I like to visualize like a healthy plant in recovery, the plant being us, and then an unhealthy, like poisoned, you know, because that I find it interesting as well that it only uses the word disease on page 64, and that refers to the resentment bit. And it's like it says, you know, it destroys more alcohol. Resentment is the number one offender. It destroys more alcoholics than anything else. From its stem all forms of spiritual disease. Oh yeah, stem. That's another little growth analogy, isn't it? It's stem. So I think of like a diseased plant ravaged with resentment, and how, well, if you're anything, you know, this is what we have to experience, isn't it? How we can let go of that. So, despite the living example of my friend, there remained in me vestiges of my old prejudice. There's that word. I'm always looking out for that word and trying to think, where am I being prejudiced about anything, about anyone, about any, you know, something to prejudge something that I don't have any experience of. Vestiges means like reminiscences. So he's saying, you know, even though he can see his friend there, he's still holding on a little bit to these old ideas. And it tells us in this book, doesn't it, that the result was nil unless we let go absolutely. We have to throw away all of our old conceptions, our old ideas. So the God word, the word God still aroused a certain antipathy. That word antipathy means a deep seated feeling of aversion. A deep seated feeling of aversion. And aversion, I had to look that up, means a strong dislike. So he really, it has a deep seated of disliking this word. When the thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. I didn't like the idea. So remember back on the other page, on page 10, he's still in that mindset of saying, you know, I became irritated. My mind snapped shut. This feeling of antipathy, it was intensified when they're trying to push it on me, you know, this God thing. I didn't like the idea. I could go for such conceptions as, and then here are some beautiful definitions for the word God: creative intelligence. So notice all the capitalized beginning bits of the words: creative intelligence, universal mind. That's like a living brain, isn't it? Like a universal power, universal mind, thinking something smart. Or spirit of nature. If you think about nature being alive and well, and you know, just as much a part of this as we are, spirit of nature. But I resisted the thought of a czar of the heavens, however loving his sway might be. And a czar basically means an emperor. So he's saying, again, he's kind of thinking, well, I don't mind these definitions, but if you tell me, what you want me to think, I don't like this idea of God that I've got, this old idea. Tsar of the heavens, however loving his sway might be, I have since talked with scores of men who felt the same way. And it tells us in the book, doesn't it, that we might work with people who have more experience of religion than us. It tells us that faith without works is dead. The book tells us that you know just keeping an open mind, that we are unlike any other. We're not a conventional organization. We're not a religious society. We can have any conception that we like. So my friend suggested, oh, and with newcomers as well, I always say to them, whenever they talk about, the God word, I agree. I'm like, yeah, me too. I was totally freaked out by the word God and the serenity prayer. And I encourage people to go and speak to others about their spiritual experiences and their understanding of this word God, and their prejudice around it, their old ideas about, religion and God and whatever. So my friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. He said, and remember how much it cost them to do the italics, why don't you choose your own conception of God? So this is basically, you know, droplets of step 2 filtered out in this chapter. That statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. So this is a beautiful analogy, thinking about how uncomfortable it is to stand in the shadow of an icy mountain, cold, stiff, dark, uncomfortable, right? Standing firm, I'm gonna prove that I'm right. And it says, and I like to think about that, how uncomfortable it would be to stand in that. And then it says, I have lived and shivered. So he's uncomfortable, he's shivering. And then he said, I stood in the sunlight at last. So thinking about this icy intellectual mountain melting away, and actually feeling the heat, the love, the sunlight of God touching my skin, my soul, my spirit. And again, there was another little reference that I thought on page 66, where it talks about resentment, and it talks about me blocking off the sunlight of the spirit. So this idea of the sunlight, the spirit entering my heart and soul, really powerful stuff. Am I going to stay cold and shivering and set in my ways, or am I going to soften and melt and thaw out? We are going to leave it there so I don't go over, but thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And I will stop the recording.